Another buster who clearly was both a crusader and planter, and also a bit more ambitious and aggressive than General Joshua, was another Claudius buster. Growing up in the rural town of Somerset of Pulaski County, Kentucky, he became the 7th Claudius to have been named after the famed Roman emperor, and therefore was more than eager to join the action to vindicate his name. Born 21 days after the new year, as his luck would have it, by the time he turned 20, he deemed himself ready to make a mark in the world. The Sons of the Republic of Texas wrote that Claudius was a fighting Irishman, refined in the use of sword and firearms, Shakespearean reader, chess player, cultured and graceful person, blessed with a strong sense of humor, farmer, soldier, and patriot. In between myth and truth, this particular Claudius would find himself squeezed somewhere in between. Kentucky was called upon during the early part of 1836, seeking 1,000 volunteers, needing only 100 from Pulaski County to train at Camp Sabine at the border of East Texas and Louisiana. Claudius jumped on his horse and rode day and night to get to the state capital. In a letter Claudius wrote when he was elected as one of the lieutenants, by the time he arrived at Frankfort, the quota had already been met.
So you see,
he explained to his friend Jenkins in his 1889 letter,
my first effort to achieve military glory was a failure. Not satisfied with this, we next made an effort to get up to a company and come on our own hook, but this also failed.
It was at this point he and his father, William Woods Buster Jr., decided to take a leap on their own terms. Leaving the rest of the family behind, together they set off by spring and arrived in eastern Texas by October. When they arrived near Berlin, several miles west of Brenham, settlers were returning simultaneously either from Louisiana or Galveston Island on the runaway escape. This was a term coined in reference to the flight of Texan settlements on the Brazo River after Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna invaded the area in February. Claudius continued to lament one more lost opportunity, missing out on the Texas Revolution by 6 months.
The Battle of Juancito,
which ended the revolution,
had been fought on the 21st of April, so you see, I missed another chance to win military laurels.
Why these two busters chose Washington County could have had a historic connection. The Austins of Washington County were two of several to arrange settlements, first with colonial Spain, then later under the Mexican government. Claudius and his father could have resolved to live any of the impresario settlements, but they didn't. Remember, William W. Jr.'s grandfather, William Jr., might have known the Austins during their time in Wythe, Virginia. The stories of the Austins might have influenced their decision to move to an area with some resounding familiarity. Not to mention, Washington County was the place where Texas Declaration of Independence was signed. Struggling to shave off monotony of farm life, Claudius persevered for adventure.
In 1839 or 40,
he reminisced,
a party of Indians came down, camped on Pond River south of where Waco now stands, threatening the frontier settlements near Old Nashville on the Brazos. Some 8 or 10 young men and myself went to their assistance, but before our arrival, the Indians broke up camp and left without making an attack. Thus, another chance for fun was missed. Our trip turned into a full hunt for buffalo, bear, and mustangs on our way home to Washington County.
Still yearning for glory, which was more important than starting a family, his restlessness took him on another crusade. He recorded his experiences as such.
In 1841, what was known as the Lewis Campaign was gotten up to the Colorado River in search of Comanche Indians who were becoming troublesome. 2 small companies under Tom Green and Jones, 100 white men and 12 Lipan Indians as guides, all commanded by Mark R. Lewis, left Austin in May. Our route was east of the Colorado, crossing the headwaters at the mouth of San Saba, up the stream 30 or 40 miles near the old mission, cross the north side and back to the Colorado and up the mouth of the Concho, up that stream to near the head springs. On this river, we found the camp of Indians we were hunting, but they had left it some weeks before we got there. Here, old Castro, our Lipan chief and guide, refused to follow their trail, saying there was no water on this route. In this campaign was my first experience of living without bread. We never tasted bread from the time we left Austin until we got back to San Antonio. We lived on beef, which we drove with us, coffee, wild meat, fish, and honey.
The Lipan peoples, an Apache band, preserved friendly relations with the Europeans, dating as far back as 1749, when they signed a peace treaty with Spain and had wanted, rather than being forced, to join the Catholic missions to solidify their allegiance. By the time the Americans came into their territory, and after the Mexican government did not honor their treaty to supply them with guns, the Lipans intuitively turned to the Americans. Their interests were mutual, as both the Lipans and the soon-to-be Texans maintained a universal enemy, the Comanche. Cuelgas de Castro of the Lipan tribe had been chief for 2 decades by the time Claudius joined, and had already signed another treaty with the Austin colonists of Washington County to acquire a fortress of people against the menacing Comanche. De Castro was born somewhere in between the 1790s, was also a scout for the Texas Rangers. Due to his unique position between Texas and Mexico, De Castro spoke at least 4 languages. Athabascan, which includes Western and Eastern Apache that are 2 distinctive languages, Spanish and English. The Lipans felt compelled to preserve a strong relationships with the whites while their people were nearly annihilated by the Comanche. So, by the age of 26, he still wasn't ready to settle down. To some extent, he seemed obsessed in his search for immortality, and to some extent, people who lived in Texas had to be that way as death was prevalent, especially violent ones, which often ended up in martyrdom. And this was the interpretation on all sides. In the spring of 1842, Claudius was a part of 3 more crusades, Valquez, Wall, and Somerville campaigns, each designed to fight off the invading Mexican army. Now, Claudius did not directly engage in these battles, but instead was used for reinforcement, if needed. It would be this experience which would finally put his crusading days into retirement. 2 years prior to the official declaration of the Mexican-American War, in retaliation of Mexico's plunder and raiding, these small campaigns rallied support from the locals. The Somerville campaign carried President Sam Houston's blessing to invade Mexico, but things went sorely south. What started out with almost 700 volunteers and militiamen leaving for San Antonio in late November, most were captured in Laredo by early December. Only 185 men returned under the command of Captain Joseph Bennett. Fearful of another failure, Alexander Somerville, who still had 500 men with him, ordered all his men to disband and return home by the way of Gonzales, just outside of San Antonio. This did not set well with the majority of them. Already revved up for blood and revenge, 308 disappointed men ignored the orders. Instead, they followed Colonel William S. Fisher, a Texan Revolutionary War hero with credentials of Lieutenant Colonel and Secretary of War for the Republic of Texas. 5 captains were placed in charge. Claudius Buster of Somerset, Kentucky, became one of them.
I can with difficulty approach the subject with the degree of patience and fortitude that the importance and the truth of history demands.
Claudius affirmed in his writings.
I have been asked the question by men whose integrity we're entitled to respect if the expedition was authorized by our government, carrying with it the idea that they had been taught to believe that it was a kind of lawless filibustering crowd or mob whose motive was pillage or robbery.
Because the Meir Expedition was not endorsed by then-President Houston before Texas set up entitlement as governor, or the Texas Congress, and ended very badly with the massacre and imprisonment, it immediately drew controversy.
Can anyone wonder that I should be indignant or sensitive when such motives as those were even hinted at?
He continued his defense.
I could only answer that so far from being the truth, that Congress of Texas, which convened after our capture, not only recognized our service, but appreciated means to alleviate our suffering.
On Christmas Eve, the men waited throughout the day, whereby none of the supplies came as they had requested from the locals. It was on Christmas when they learned from a captive that 3,000 Mexican soldiers, commanded by General Pedro de Ampudia, blocked their delivery. Outraged and desperate, 261 men crossed over the river later into the night to retrieve what they needed. Claudius was one of them. The next day, a battle on the river pursued. Claudius admitted this was his first battle despite the other expeditions he had been on. One of his men wrote in his diary, the bullets
fell like hail against a wall immediately in the rear of Buster's company, which was not over 5 feet high.
Outnumbered by nearly 10 to 1, Claudius and his party remarkably managed to slay 600 while wounding 200, leaving only 30 Texan casualties. Hungry, thirsty, and nearly out of ammo, they were compelled to surrender when General Ampudia sent a white flag with a peace offering. The terms were suggested as such: surrender, and lives would be spared by becoming prisoners of war. Both General Ampudia and Colonel Fisher were caught between a rock and a hard place. Although each side understood the Mexican military would ultimately win, but how many more soldiers would die for that victory? It would be a matter of time if the Texans continued to fight before it would repeat another Alamo scenario. The Texans fighting on the river, who fortified themselves within the city of Meir, were taken as prisoners, all 243. Others managed to escape, including the Texas Rangers, who knew better. In a letter Claudius wrote, he skipped the details about the battle entirely, so what role he played is ambiguous, and, at the same time, referred to the conduct of surrender more along the lines as a straightforward capture rather than a mutual agreement. Nothing was mentioned about General Ampudia overturning the execution decree. Quite possibly, Claudius may not have known about it, therefore he couldn't have appreciated how lucky they were for the time being. Claudius's new year and birthday would begin as a prisoner of war. Walking over 120 miles south of the Rio Grande River, first they reached to Matamoros, which still bordered Texas, but then they trekked further southwest to Monterey, onto Salido, and then to a ranch called Salado, an additional 150 miles, heading toward the center of Mexico by early February of 1843. Their final destination was to be Mexico City. Before Salado, twice they planned to escape, but as Claudius vaguely explained,
each time we were balked by untoward circumstances.
However, on the 11th of February, their third attempt was more favorable, and he declared it as the Battle of the Rescue. The attack was swift, lasting for 15 minutes. He explained in minor details.
Our guard, under the command of General Berrigan, consisted of infantry and cavalry in about equal numbers, outnumbering us about 2 to 1. We were guarded in an enclosed corner of the courtyard of about 50 yards square. The balance of the infantry, not on immediate duty, had stacked their arms near the center of this courtyard, and in full view our men as they rushed out of our small enclosure through the small door of this yard. The men who first got out and ran and seized these arms and distributed them among the men as they came out of the door. The infantry was taken by surprise and made but feeble resistance. At the outer or larger gate was stationed a stronger guard, and they had time to prepare for resistance. They succeeded in firing only one volley before we were upon them. They gave way at once, and about one half of the cavalry mounted and scrambled off. We secured about 90 head of their horses. We lost 4 or 5 men in battle, and they were about the same number. Our men had been instructed not to kill anyone unnecessarily, as we were compelled to leave in the hands of 15 or 20 men, some wounded, some sick, and a few unwilling to risk the chances of escape. All we wanted was liberty, including their arms, horses, and such other things as deemed needful in our efforts to get home.
They stole some silver coins as part of their spoils, and Claudius was the only one who was left taking a little burro for his ride, while the others selected horses. 179 survived their escape altogether. Their journey brought them about 50 to 60 miles out during the wee hours of the darkened morning, where they slept until daylight. They hoped to retrieve water at the first hacienda they found, but Mexican soldiers surrounded it and fired at them for a long range of 200 yards.
Not wishing to be detained, we marched on,
He quipped.
pretending not to see them. The only harm their firing did to us was wounding one of the horse at the bursting of the man's stirrup.
Following a northern trail up a mountain, they finally found a pool of water, making a full day without it since their escape. As they pressed onward, again they were forced to pass by another hacienda filled with soldiers, by which both sides ignored each other. The next day, Claudius stumbled upon some bad luck.
In descending this mountain, I lost my famous Jenny. I loaned her to a big, nearsighted Dutchman. Going down the steep mountainside, the burro had failed and rolled from under him. That night was very dark, and he could not find her.
His luck and the luck of the men did not improve. Despite running into another Englishman or American, perhaps a New Englander's dialect he wasn't able to distinguish between the two, who gave them advice on how to get out of Mexico, they did not heed this man's guidance. Claudius explained that the men, being a democratic bunch, elected a new leader, Captain Cameron, to replace their other leader, Jordan. You see, Jordan abandoned his men in an attempt to escape back to Texas by himself, with a little help from some people he knew in Mexico. A few of his men swore upon his success, and therefore, the newly elected Cameron decided to chase Jordan's path through the mountains. Leaving the road most traveled by, they crossed into the mountains that they knew nothing about, nor having a guide who did. Because February was not part of the rainy season, and the desert mountain range had not produced snow, the ravines were bone dry. Some men did manage to find a little bit of water a mile or so from the campsite at one point, however. The lack of game animals and hunger pains influenced them to kill and eat their horses. Claudius confessed,
Here was presented a scene which I can never forget, and which could have been performed by our men only under circumstances of direst necessity. While some of the men were killing and butchering our faithful animals, others were building fires and scaffolds for cooking. Our saddle wallets, by cutting them in two, were converted into haversacks.
As they set on foot, they left behind several men on the trail too weak to go on. Eventually, those men would be picked up by the Mexican soldiers. As night descended, they returned to the trail to head back to their company.
Fancy our feelings when we found a company of Mexican cavalry was on our trail,
Claudius joked.
Consequently, we were cut off from our main body of men, so instead of trying to rejoin them, we took the back track. Tubes, in his weak state, threw away his gun and cartridges, also his meat. I held onto my gun and part of my ammunition.
On day 7, his troop was captured yet again.